not wood turning, Daddy?
I reckon it's time I did a bit more knife making. Well, we're going to make a knife. And I've got 3 blades here, which I bought several years ago. And they're all from Finland. And they're traditional Finnish blades. And they were made by a blacksmith in Finland called Puronvarsi. And that's his maker's mark on there. And yeah, these are traditional sort of Finnish Laplander or Sami blades. These 2 are what are known as Puukko blades, Puukko knives. And this one is a luku, which is a much bigger sort of camp knife, I suppose you'd call it. We're still in lockdown. And so there's a limit to what materials I've got, and really I can't do the big one because I haven't got enough leather and bits and stuff for doing that one. So I might make one or both of these. I'll put that one to one side. We'll have a look at these Puukkos. Handle material, I've got 2 beautiful pieces of curly birch, which my friend Osmo in Finland sent me, and these I've stabilised. And if you look at my back through my videos, you'll see that I did a video on knife stabilising wood for knife handles, and these blocks actually featured in that. I'm thinking I'll do this sort of medium-sized Puukko, but I'd really like to use this block because I love the grain pattern on that. It's absolutely stunning. But I think I'll have to save that for the little fella because I don't think there's enough wood by the time I've got rid of that bark. I don't think there'll be enough wood to form a decent handle for that size. So I'm going to use this one, I think. And that's what the starting point. The very first thing you have to do with any blade is to make a bolster, and that's the piece that goes across here to form to form the bolster. And I'm going to use brass for that, and so I'm going to go and find a bar of brass. And these are notoriously difficult to make bolsters for because they've got a rhombic cross section. I'm just measuring up, marking out some brass bar here. I think it's 1/8 of an inch roughly. Just centre punching for some drilling into the machine vise to go on the drill press. And I've drilled out a few holes and then joining them up with the scroll saw with a metal cutting blade in. And then a bit of filing just to neaten up the hole. And then lots of test fitting, keep knocking the brass onto the tang of the knife and then filing a bit more off and refitting it and filing a bit more off. Eventually you should end up with something like this. You can see how irregularly shaped the tang is on these Puronvarsis, and that's why they're very difficult to make. You have to make them each one individually. I'm just going to hammer this down on the tang now. Just to get the final fit. Should get it fitting like that so there's no gaps. No gaps at the shoulder, no gaps around the tang. That's about as good as I'll get on that blade, because there are bits of the tang which are actually thicker than it is at the shoulder, you know, further up the stick tang. But that is pretty good. Next job is to polish that front face, because once it's fixed on the blade you can't get to that bit. Combination of wet and dry and a buffing wheel to bring that up to a mirror finish. And there it is on the tang. Here's the stabilised curly birch block which I'm going to use for the handle. I'm just going to square it off on my bench sander here on the disc. Square off all the sides, which will make it easier for marking out and more accurate for drilling for the tang. There's my handle block all squared up, and this is fibre liner material, and I'm going to put a few layers of this each end of the block just to add a bit of sort of decorative interest. So that's the next job, is just to cut out some rectangles of this that will slot over the tang. Back on my record power scroll saw just to cut out the holes in these liners. It's the perfect tool for this. So that's how it all stacks up. I can then draw around the tang to mark it on the block, ready for drilling. So I've just centre marked where I'm going to be drilling from. And because this is all square, once it's in my machine vise, I should be able to angle the drill to drill in line with these lines. And I'll go from the top and from the bottom. And then we'll file them until they all match the tang of the knife. So onto the drill press, and I'm checking my angles first before drilling, and the drill bit is the size of the thickest bit of the tang. So going from the pommel end first, then checking my angles before I do the other drill holes in the blade end, re-angling it in the machine vise each time, so that I'm following the outline of the tang in effect. Here I'm using a 3D drill bit just to join up these holes. Job done. Then it's a case of using these tiny little rasps just to go in here and just keep working on it until the tang fits. I'll get back to you. Well, that's a very pleasing fit. You know, it's got to be relatively snug because you want to keep glue volume down to a minimum, but at the same time it's got to be a passive fit so that you know it seats when you're gluing it. Here I've cut out a slightly thicker bit of brass to make the pommel, and I've drilled a little hole that will accept the tang, and I'm just widening that with this square file, needle file, and I'm also forming a funnel shape, a slight taper. So the top side is going to be wider than the bottom side because it's going to be peened over the tang is, and it needs something to engage in. Here it is, just about ready for assembly. We've got the brass bolster. That's been epoxied into position. We've got 3 fibre liners, black, red, black. We've then got the wooden handle blank, which is all shaped. I've put an extra hole in there, which I'll tell you about in a minute. That goes on like that with the tang coming through. This is a rat tail tang that's going to be peened, so it comes right through rather than a hidden tang which stops inside the wooden handle. We've then got the brass pommel, and the other thing I've done with this brass pommel is I have drilled a hole and threaded it M5 to take this M5 brass screw or bolt, and so that is fixed in there, and that passively sits in this hole, this extra hole I've drilled in the end. Probably totally unnecessary, but it just means that even if the peening over of this end doesn't work as well as it could, it will never come apart because this will be locked into epoxy resin inside the handle. This will all be cut off and polished over eventually. But that's the plan. The other thing I'm going to have to do is just anneal the end of that tang just to make sure it's soft to peen over. I suspect the blacksmith had done that, but I've got to make sure. I don't want to get it all together and find that my hammer's not touching it. So I should get the blowtorch to that, get it red hot, and then let it cool down. And I'll clamp on some mole grips just to act as heat sinks. That's the pommel ready. I've countersunk that a fraction and screwed that well in tight, taken the head off on the sander, and so that's all fixed now. And that should just all slot together there, like that. That extra bolt there stops that twisting and will help retain the pommel on the end. Using a blowtorch to heat the end of the tang, heating it up so it's really, glowing, and then let it cool down and hopefully it's softened it a bit. Then it's time for the big glue up. Using a slow set epoxy, it's West Systems G-Flex epoxy, which is incredibly strong stuff and very slow setting, so it's ideal for a job like this where the glue up takes a bit of time. Making sure every layer is thoroughly coated and the tang, and I'm filling up the inside of the wood block, the hole down the middle. I'm using a syringe to fill that up with epoxy. And this gets squidged down onto the tang. Filling up the hole for the brass screw. Plenty more epoxy between the liners and the handle. As I say, building it up in layers. Then it's on goes the pommel, making sure that brass screw's thoroughly coated. Getting plenty of epoxy in there. You get plenty ooze out, but you're better off having too much than not enough. Then I'm peening it over with a ball peen hammer. This was difficult. It's not something I've done before. Hold it all together overnight in a knife making clamp. Here it is out of the knife making vise or clamp, all glued up. 24 hours later, it's a very slow set epoxy, very strong epoxy. I'm now going to sort of sketch a rough design of the knife on the side here, and then I can start trimming the edges on the sanding machine and the bandsaw. Here it is after cutting out on the bandsaw. This is just a very rough cut. This won't be the finished shape, or profile should I say. I've just got a note that I shouldn't go any deeper at this point because otherwise I'll hit the brass screw that's in there. So that's the sort of stop point almost. And it's a case of profiling it. Now I'll start off by doing this on the disc sander. And I shall rock it backwards and forwards and just run around on the disc just to smooth it all out. And then we'll start taking the corners off on the belt. And I use this softer part of the belt for some of it because there's a little bit of give just there. It's difficult to film while I'm using the disc sander, but I'll get back to you once I've just neatened up the edges. Beginning to look more like a knife now. I've got the sort of side profile right, and you can just see the liners are beginning to show their colours, and yeah, that's looking good. I think I've got the bolster to roughly the length I want it. I've got to sort out the width next. Beautiful patterns in this wood. But when you're doing this, particularly with thick bits of brass, just do it a little bit at a time, because you don't want to start cooking the epoxy. It does build up a lot of heat. But the next job will be, I'm just going to taper where the bolster is and get a nice even taper both sides. Now whenever you're doing this, always be aware of where this is. You don't want to clip it on the disc or on the belt when you're shaping. There's one clip of that and you've ruined a very expensive blade. So always have in mind where that is and keep it taped up for safety. So I've got the sort of rough profile. This will change slightly. I'll take a bit more bulk off here. But we're going to start taking these corners off, these edges off at 45 degrees, And I try and keep it as geometric to start with as possible, so that I'm removing an even amount from each side to keep a nice profile. Just remember when you're doing this, you can always take off but you can't put back on, so take your time, just do a little bit at a time. You're better off undercutting and going back and doing a bit more. Don't overheat the brass, it gets very hot very quickly with friction. And be careful what you're doing with this end. Don't cut yourself, don't let the machine launch it at you, and don't catch this on the disc or you'll spoil the blade. The only discs I've got for this at the minute are these 120s, and they're a bit fine really. I could really do with an 80 grit on here. And here I am on the sanding machine. Like I say, doing it bit by bit, taking my time. Just trying to sort of remove the same amount from each side to give it a nice profile. Creating angles first, which I can then round off. I do that by adopting a sort of a rolling action on that softer bit of the belt where it's unsupported. But do it bit by bit. You can always take off, but you can't put back on. And keep checking it. You don't want to overcut. Using the end of the belt sander to get in the concavities, and then rolling the pommel around to give it a nice profile. Get it all nice and rounded. Onto my vise, and using strips of emery cloth or cloth backed abrasive, and this gets it nice and round. I want to get rid of any flat spots or any angles. I want it all beautifully round. And you're also getting rid of the deeper scratches from the sanding belt. And sanding along the handle as well, and sanding it all by hand, and going right up to 1200. And there it is, all beautifully smooth. And then I tape off the handle because I don't want it getting black when I polish the brass. And this is what I'm going to polish it with: Hulk poo, Smurf poo and Vonax. So I've got the buffing wheel fixed on my lathe, and starting off with the Hulk poo on a very coarse wheel. And this removes the scratches from the sanding. Keep it moving, don't let it overheat, and keep a really firm grip. You do not want this flying off when you're buffing it, because it'll do you serious damage. There we are, after going through the grades, and I'm now taping off the brass so I can finish the wood. And I'm going to use a bit of Liberon's finishing oil. Doesn't need many coats because this is stabilised. It's got nowhere to soak in really. It really is just to treat the surface layer. There's the finished knife. Finish being the operative word. Finished Puukko knife with finished curly birch, stabilised curly birch handle. Brass pommel, brass bolster, red and black liners. Absolutely delighted with that piece of wood that Osmo sent me. I will put a link to his channel in the description. It's Osmo, his channel's called the Topicala. Very pleased with how it went. The pommel is all polished up nice. You can just see the tang and the brass bolt there. It's all polished. Little bit disappointed in that there's a slight gap between the shoulders and the bolster, which is a no-no in knife making terms really. It's very disappointing because when I made the bolster and actually epoxied it onto the tang, there was no gap at all. It was one of the best fitting bolsters I've ever made, and I'm a real perfectionist when it comes to things like that. I was really pleased. It was a brilliant fitting bolster on a difficult shaped blade. But at some point, probably when I was very badly peening the end over, I suspect I broke the bond on the epoxy and the bolster moved. I did clamp it all up for the epoxy to set, but I only clamped between the bolster and the pommel to keep it all together. if I'd brought up the third layer of my clamp, it would have stopped that happening. It would have compressed it all together again and it would have seated, which is very disappointing. It's still a knife, it's still a good knife and I'm pleased with it, but I am disappointed that a little gap's appeared. I mean, it's not much, but it should be nothing. I'll show you the clamp. Here it is. I had it clamped between these top two layers with the blade coming through here. I should have brought this bottom layer up and compressed it into the tip of the blade, and that would have pushed the bolster up against the shoulders of the blade, but I didn't. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll be back soon with part 2 where I make the sheath for this knife. Here's a few stills. Many thanks for watching. You won't have to wait long for part 2. I've already made the knife sheath. I've just got to finish editing the video, so I'll get that up as soon as I can. It was just getting a bit too long to do it all in one video. Here's some pictures just showing off that beautiful curly birch. And I enjoyed doing it. Great project. If you haven't ever made a knife, it's well worth doing. It's very satisfying. Very pleased with the pommel and the liners. They look great.
More rubbish coming soon. Please like, share and subscribe. My daddy needs all the help he can get.
As I said, I won't keep you waiting long for part 2 where I make the knife sheath. Back very soon, as soon as I've finished editing.